And welcome back to Rethinking Trauma and Transition. And today we have Holly, who's from Blooming Minds.
Hello.
Welcome, Holly. It's lovely to see you again.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It's nice to see you too.
So, Holly, Rich and I met you when we attended your suicide first aid intervention course.
Yes.
And we thought it would be a good conversation to share with others, because I think the more awareness that's out there about suicide prevention and suicide intervention and how to have those conversations and what to be aware of, the better.
Well, especially this time of year as well, Ali, because coming up Christmas, coming up New Year, and the dark months of December, January, February, there's a lot of suicide around that as well.
Absolutely. And I think, you're right. The more we can have these conversations, the less it becomes something that you can't talk about and that you can't get support for and you don't know where there is support. The more you kind of just have conversations with as many audiences as possible, the better it's going to be. And you're right, Rich, there's loads of mental health conditions which we know get worse in the darker, colder months. But actually, there's Christmas coupled with a financial crisis and a cost of living crisis. There's so many kind of increased risk factors right now. Mm-hmm. So, delighted to be here. Thank you very much for having me.
You're more than welcome to come on.
Can we invite you to tell us a little bit about what you actually do, Holly?
Yes. So I suppose really what I do is deliver training. So with that, I go into workplaces, schools, anywhere, individuals can come on to really try and get people to understand, both with regards to general mental health, but more specifically with regards to suicide. What is it that leads someone to think about suicide? And then how do we as individuals recognize that in other people? And then what do you do about it? So, once you've spotted a sign, how do you kind of make that first step into having that conversation? If that person says they are thinking about suicide, what do you do? I think it's so hard for us to ask that question. So it makes you realize just how impossible it is for that person to just say, help me over here, I need some help. We have to have people who know how to kind of get involved and how to do that safely.
So Rich and I were very recently in London at the launch of the Forcer Protocol, which is a protocol that's there to hopefully get aid to veterans in crisis and ensure that is as fast as possible. And it's a collaboration between Safe and Found and the UK Police Force piloted across Greater Manchester area. What was interesting for me was some of the statistics behind that. And I know certainly that was eye-opening when you came and trained Rich and I in suicide first aid intervention, was the statistics and the numbers behind that. And I wondered if that was worth sharing some of those, because they really do make you stop and think.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the statistics around suicide as a whole, every single year across the world, 800,000 people are recorded as dying through suicide. But then when you unpick that, there's so many deaths which probably are a suicide that aren't recorded as that. So significantly higher than 800,000. But when you look at kind of thoughts of suicide, how many people are thinking about suicide at any given time? 1 in 20. So when you think about that, I live in Liverpool or just outside Liverpool, and in my little area, there's probably 20,000 people within a 5-mile radius of me now that are thinking about suicide right now. Mm-hmm. And, no matter where you are in the world, 1 in 20 of us will be thinking about suicide. And that really, I don't know, as I lost my brother to suicide 20 years ago. And to me, that kind of, it gave me, obviously it doesn't make it better. Of course it doesn't, but it did give me a little bit of comfort to know that this wasn't so unusual. And it wasn't something drastically wrong that me or my family or people around my brother had done that made him think of suicide. In actual fact, thoughts of suicide are really common. So it's a bit of a roundabout way of saying that, but it was a bit of a comfort to know that this is something that is a real public health issue, that is global, that is huge, that so many people think about suicide throughout their lifetime, that everybody has got a role to play in kind of doing something about it.
And yet, for something that is such a large number and so prevalent, how many of us have conversations about that, or even have a conversation about that.
It's so hard to talk about, isn't it? It really is. And I think before I experienced my, personal loss, I'd never considered that word suicide. It was something that just did not exist in my kind of stratosphere. I was studying psychology at university at the time, and we talked about mental health. We talked about how the mind works and all the rest of it. But this was just this random word that, that's something that happens to other people. That's not something that happens to us, or to me. And I think until you have that experience, when you're going through it, it feels very isolating, like you are the only person. And only by talking about it, we are going to see that it is so, so common.
Well, there's a lot of stigma around it still. One in the narrative of how words are used and people's perceptions. So people are still saying committed suicide when in British Isles it's no longer a crime. It hasn't been for what? Since the 1960s?
Yeah, 1961.
And again, people still think this is a selfish act.
Yeah. And that word, that's selfish. You've got to remember that at that time when that person's considering suicide, their thoughts are distorted. So that kind of, if you think about it, the way your brain kind of works, isn't it? Your reptilian brain, your pleasure, pain, you're in such a lot of pain, and that is in overload. Your rational thinking and your clarity is so dulled in comparison to that need to reduce the amount of pain that you're in. The pain that you're in has tipped the scales of what you're able to cope with, coupled with the fact that you feel like your friends, your family, your loved ones, everybody around you would be better if you went there, because you're feeling that sense of worthlessness and hopelessness and burden and guilt. That actually, it's quite a selfless act, in the sense that through those dark, distorted thoughts there, that person's doing it because they feel like, and this is distorted, this isn't true thoughts. They're feeling at that moment like they're going to make their families' lives easier. 20 years on, I can categorically say it doesn't make your family's lives easier. That is a distorted way of thinking. However, yeah, absolutely. That word, selfish, needs to be chucked in the bin, doesn't it, Rich? It's just a horrible way to describe it. Yes, still it's kind of held on by so many people still, isn't it?
When I was having conversations with you, Holly, what was interesting for me was being able to place how the brain ends up at that, how our thinking ends up at that as a viable option. And once I kind of wrapped my head around that, it was one of those ones where the pieces start to make sense of that journey, because ultimately our brain and our thoughts are only ever trying to find a way to keep us in our preferable base state. They want us to return to a base point of being okay. So when we are experiencing things that take us away from that in a negative direction, then our brain's response is to do everything it can to get us back to that okay point.
Yeah.
But if it's tried everything else and it knows that the crisis and the experience that we're having is unsustainable, we can't keep going with that because this is not sustainable. It's almost like it starts to get desperate in its solution finding.
Yeah, definitely.
And that's when those thoughts of suicide start to, in a fuzzy way, in a way, make sense, because it will stop the suffering. It will, in an odd way, almost return the system to a calmer state. It will stop that elevated suffering.
Yeah, it's a permanent solution, isn't it, to a temporary problem, isn't it? And even though, how do you stop pain? Well, going to sleep. If you think about that, death kind of being that permanent sense of sleep, well, that is a way. If I have a really terrible day, I will want to go to sleep to have that bit of escapism. We all do things. We all do things when we've had a rubbish day that help us kind of manage that, cope that, express how we feel, release some of that pressure perhaps. And actually, suicide is the ultimate extreme of that, isn't it? Mm. And so I think that the challenge lies in getting people to recognize that seeking help in that time where there feels like there aren't any other options, like you've exhausted all other options, how do we speak to people in that moment to know, hang on a minute, there are other choices? In a nutshell, how do we get that person to just wait until they've kind of spoken to someone else about that? And I think that is a challenge that I don't know how we're ever going to overcome, because for people who've had fleeting thoughts of suicide, and perhaps they might have had support at some time or another, they might have a safety plan or people they know they can turn to. But what about for those people that have never thought about suicide before? And something happens, something else happens, all of a sudden they might have used substances, they might have other vulnerabilities that are happening at that time, and all of a sudden it's tipped into, I have no other solutions here left. Sometimes that behaviour can happen really rapidly. And, so I really feel like there's so much work that's been going on behind the scenes with so many amazing charities. How do we speak to the people in that group there? Because those out of the blue suicides are quite rare, but they do happen. How do you help those people? And to me, the only way is by getting to them before that point. If everybody did some sort of suicide awareness, not necessarily training, obviously that would be marvelous, but just listening to this kind of conversation, having some sort of awareness, they will know that suicide thoughts are something that are never far from anybody. Anybody can think of suicide. So before you get to that stage, let's think about what you're going to do if ever you're in that position where you're thinking about it. Everybody needs to create a safety plan before they need it, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And also, Holly, I'll go back to that word you used, that distortion of the mind. It's also distortion of time.
Yeah.
Because people who are thinking of completing suicide can't see past that point. Yeah. And that end point is final. There's no future. There's no hope. Yeah. There's nothing beyond that. And so it's helping that person to expand that time frame, maybe by a day, maybe by a couple of minutes, maybe by a day, to be able to see there is something beyond what they're going through at that particular moment in time.
Yeah. And that's so hard, isn't it? Because for many people who have been living in that kind of real intense turmoil and distortion for such a long time, isn't it? There's a gentleman who springs to mind who I've spoken to at length, and he said for him, he felt like he was dead for years before he actually made that attempt on his life. So for him, the actual act of doing suicide behaviour was just that final piece of the puzzle. And it wasn't scary, and it wasn't something that he was really desperately wanting to avoid. It actually felt like a natural end to his very challenging and difficult story. But now he made that attempt on his life, and he's thankfully survived. Somebody found him and he survived. Now he can see just how distorted his thinking was. And actually, he needed someone to come in and grab him and keep him safe, because he knew he couldn't keep himself safe during that time. And luckily, there was someone who was near him who recognised that things were going wrong for this gentleman and was spiralling out of control, who was able to put some steps in place, or perhaps he wouldn't be here. And he's a fellow instructor now. He goes around delivering these courses all over the place, and is absolutely marvellous. He's a wonderful person and very happy to be alive. And I think that's a real key message, isn't it? That just because you feel one way now, there's plenty of experience with regards to mental health in the room. I know that between all three of us, we all have our own journeys that we've been on. And all of us, there are times in our lives that perhaps we didn't ever realise that we'd get to the point that we are right now. For people living in that time now where life feels quite hopeless, to know that there are so many people that have walked those steps and are the other side. And not like, there's all rainbows and puppies everywhere and it's all absolute brilliance. However, there is joy in life that can follow real dark periods of your life too. You might not see the hope, but it is there.
If I can get through it, other people can as well.
Absolutely. That's it. Yeah.
I'm sure that is the same in yourself, Holly.
Yeah, that's it, And I don't know if I like the phrase, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, but you definitely learn from your experiences, don't you?
Otherwise we wouldn't be doing what we're doing now.
Definitely not. Yeah.
I think, Rich, you and I were having this conversation just yesterday, weren't we? Where I'd said that when I look back on my life so far, there are elements of that I wouldn't wish somebody else to experience. And I think we all have those that I wouldn't have chosen to experience, that were really difficult at the time, But each and every single one of them now, I have found a purpose for. I have found a use for. And as a result, while I still wouldn't wish anyone else to experience that, and I wouldn't choose to myself, I actually wouldn't change any of that, because then I wouldn't be me and I wouldn't be where I am today. It might take me a while to find a placement for it, but I am learning that I will at some point find a placement for it.
That's a really nice way to kind of experience trauma, isn't it? And a really nice way to, it's almost kind of like when you're going through something difficult, to still have that bird's eye view that at some point in my life, this will make some sort of sense, you know? It might not be.
I suppose it's not even so much sense, isn't it? I will find a purpose for this. It's not that this is happening intentionally to me, or that I'm meant to experience this, but I will find a use for it that isn't just about the negatives.
Yeah.
There will be something I can take from this that is of benefit to me.
I like that. I like that.
It's going from that victim mindset to more of a positive mindset.
Yeah. Yeah. And when you think collectively how many people that maybe we've spoken to about recovery, mental health, suicide, you know, trauma, like finding your way after what might have happened to you, there's got to be many, many people that you've positively touched as a result of your experiences.
Well, I think it's also about having a little bit of patience about how we place those experiences as well. And it might take a while. And for some of the experiences, for me, it's taking years. But at some point, I'm like, oh, look at you, right? I know how to use you now. I still don't like that that's there, but I know how to use you.
Yeah.
I know what positive I can reflect back from that in. And that's not making the experience positive, it's making the journey positive.
Yeah. Yeah. I was talking to someone the other day about grief. I was delivering a course around kind of understanding grief and bereavement. And he said that when something like this happens, you know, and he was talking about the loss of a relative, he said, you know, you don't learn to live with it, but you carve a place for it in your life. And I really liked how he described it, you know, and you can kind of imagine sitting in your cave and it all feels very grim for a time. And then you do start to carve a space so that you can still do the life you want to do. And you've got this added element that you do carry with you. Yeah, I like that. Yeah, kind of, it becomes a better version of you.
I'm wondering, Holly, what would a safety plan look like for someone?
Yeah, so a safety plan can look like many different things, but in a nutshell, it's kind of what the first thing you would want to consider is, and this needs to be done. You can do a safety plan with someone in that moment when they're thinking about suicide, and then it might be a bit more practical about where you're going to go and who you're going to call. But actually, it's quite good to revisit that when that person is in maybe a bit more of a positive mindset, to get that person to start to understand what are the first things that, you know, when I'm starting to have that decline in my mental health and starting to think about suicide and starting to have that perhaps dip, what are the first things that happen? Is it my sleep that's affected? Is it my diet, you know, and my kind of appetite that's affected? You know, how am I at work? What's my behavior like? What are my relationships like at that time? What are my particular triggers? And try to understand what your kind of like early warning signs are, so that when those alarm bells start to ring, we can start to kind of put some measures in place to hopefully avoid a major crisis, isn't it? And to get that straight away. The earlier we can guide someone to support, the more likely it is that recovery is going to be quicker and less painful, you know? But then kind of to start to think about, yes, the practicalities. What does it look like? But yes, when I am thinking about suicide, what do I need to do? Are there particular places that I can go that might calm me? I've worked on a safety plan with a lady. For her, it was the 24-hour Tesco. That was her first place that she would go, because she knew that she could just walk up and down the aisles and count things and look at things. And actually, it was almost like a bit of mindfulness, if you like. But, you know, being mindfully in the moment within Tesco, there's always someone on hand. There's someone there that she could speak to if she needed to. And she also knew that apart from a brief window on a Sunday night, that is always available to her, So there isn't one set way. It's kind of whatever makes sense for that person. But, obviously the obvious ones might be going to A&E or going to the out of hours, going to GP, going to a family members, people that you trust within your life who you might turn to. And then you're also going to have people that you could call, things like the Samaritans, 116, 123, 24/7. There's people there who are trained professionals who will be able to guide you. The shout line, there's lots of places that you would want to consider. So you've got your kind of warning signs, if you like, then who you're going to call. And then, what can you do? Do you have some breathing exercises that you could do? Do you have, certain kind of journals that you might fill or music that you might put on, things that might help you stay calm and keep calm? What are your reasons for living? Do you have some particular pictures that you might like to look at that will help ground you in the moment? So that is kind of your immediate crisis safety plan. So that's one aspect of it. But then you also want to then think about a bit more long term, and this is maybe what you might call a coping plan, a bit more about that's in the moment. And I think that quite a lot of suicide training kind of finishes there. You what to do in the moment. And that's great. It's necessary. It's needed. It's often quicker to go to attend training that is just that kind of, 2 hours or 4 hours. It gives you the idea of how to have that conversation and then that's it. But the reality is, particularly for the likes of what you guys do, for people who have family members, friends that might be living through this, you don't just never see that person again. You're supporting that person tomorrow and the next day and the next day. And that person might not be thinking about suicide that day, but they might think about suicide again. And how do we kind of support them a bit more long term? So for that, we need to start to think about where is that person's pain? What is it that's making them think of suicide? Is it issues around debt or gambling or substances or being alone, lack of social connection, all of these things, and start to kind of make those connections we call them life supports. So where can we make them connections so that there is hope and there is a plan of action? And there is things to be kind of that we can help them link in with to kind of like create a bit more of a holistic plan, if you like, to keep that person safer long term. So you've got the do now, and then you've got the kind of consider for like going forwards.
I'm wondering if I'm going to be a bit controversial here.
Yeah.
Because I suppose from the conversations I've had with people,
yeah,
there are a couple of things that have always struck me. One was that once you have that experience in your life, it's almost like it becomes part of the options list that you review in decision making. It might not always be at the top, and it'll gradually move down that options list as other things and other strategies come into your life and circumstances change. But it's there because it's part of our lived experience. It's a bit like when you were talking about grief, finding a place for it in your life. It's now part and parcel of our experiences, whether that's through something we have tried to put into play or something that we have seen somebody we love and care about try to put into play.
Definitely. And I think, the research behind that suggests that having a thought of suicide doesn't necessarily increase your risk of going on to end your life.
No. And I think
on that behavior, it does. Yeah.
But I also think that sometimes the feedback I get from people when I work with them is that one of the things they appreciate is the safety to say, I reviewed my list today without me going into panic mode. Because I'll go, okay, then tell me a bit more about that then. Because what I'll be doing is almost that dynamic risk assessment of how high up is it today.
Yeah.
But I do it, and I'm having that conversation quite factually where they've got, I suppose, the freedom to express that and know that they're not immediately going to set alarm bells racing or whatever. They have the space to have a conversation and explore that topic. To go, well, this wasn't what was going on. This was there. I just noticed it today, but actually it's not. Yeah. And they've got the space to say, I have no intention there, but I recognise that that's still there. It's maybe sitting at 8 in the list of 10 now. it was at 5, but it's moving.
I think that's really interesting. And I think there's a couple of things from that. You know, so often when people hear the word suicide, say you're somebody who's thinking about suicide and you do choose to tell someone, well, the danger there, isn't it, is that person going to, you know, say, oh, don't be daft. You don't feel like that. It's not that bad. You know, think about this, think about that, and then move on and kind of almost assume it's not serious. Or are they going to completely overreact? Not everybody having suicide thoughts, you know, thoughts of suicide needs 999, needs a hospital admission. You know, the reality is there just isn't a place for someone within a hospital situation for someone who's having fleeting thoughts of suicide. You know, that's just not the right place for that person. What they need is, you know, someone like, you know, you or, you know, a caring person in their life to sit down and let them get it out and talk about it and think about what other strategies they've got that they could utilize instead, with the knowledge that if you feel like you can't keep safe, this is what you're going to do. But that kind of, it's true, isn't it? Sometimes people do overreact because they hear that word suicide and it sounds really scary and it sounds really serious. So all of a sudden we have to do something. Our safeguarding procedures kick in. You know, we have to follow this procedure.
Well, what's interesting about that is what you do is you stop the conversation.
Yeah.
And what's really powerful is the conversation.
Yeah. And we rush to fix it mode. We don't want to help that person work it out because subconsciously, this is a really hard conversation to have. You know, it's not nice to hear someone talk about how their life is so difficult right now that ending it seems like the only choice. So we want to rush to how can we make it better to get ourselves out of that kind of difficult place. But the magic happens when we listen and we let that person just get it out, isn't it? Mm-hmm. There's a lovely picture that I've seen about therapy where it's kind of this big ball of like messed up wall, I think it is, in someone's head, and the therapist is just pulling it into a nice neat ball when you get it out, isn't it? Just sharing is just kind of hugely beneficial.
But I think we were discussing with Kim Bond about childhood ACEs and that disclosure to someone. And the first words is, thank you for telling me.
Yeah.
And obviously, if you wouldn't mind repeating sort of like those similar questions, is thank you for telling me, how can we help you now, isn't it? It's all that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, you know, well, first of all, how do you recognize if someone's thinking about suicide, what things should you be looking out for? And actually, you know, there isn't a tick list. You know, there are many tick lists out there that you can have a look at on the internet. However, change, you know, is what you're looking for, isn't it? If something doesn't seem right to someone, there might be some real red flags that they might be talking about dying or suicide. You know, they might be telling you they want to end their life. That might be something that's really obvious. But actually, it could be something, just anything that seems a bit unusual and seems a bit final and makes you just kind of think that's not typical for them. And then you're right, you know, we need to ask them. And you don't have to rush straight in with, you know, you don't see yourself at the minute. Are you thinking about suicide? No. But we say, you don't see yourself at the minute. Can you just explain what's been going on for you, you know? And you just explore. It's like a natural conversation, isn't it? You don't need to rush to it, but you also need to be prepared to be direct and ask the question. And when we come to actually kind of going to ask the question, you know, you've explored a little bit and you are fairly sure that there's something going on here. You're concerned that perhaps suicide is what might be on their mind and you want to ask. What we don't want to ask is, do you want to? You know, do you want to end your life? Because the reality is that most people thinking about suicide don't want their lives to end. They just don't want their lives to be what they are right now.
They just want what they're experiencing to end and change.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Because that may seem like the last option they've got because everything else isn't working up to that point.
Absolutely. So we ask, are you thinking about suicide? You know, and that's probably a really key one to try and remember because, you know, are you thinking about suicide? Because regardless of what your wants or your desires, or do you intend to end your life? You know, all of these things, you know, they might not be sure about. But are you thinking about suicide? Well, it's either in their mind or it's not. So are you thinking about suicide is a really good way to ask. Using that word suicide has been, you know, shown through lots of different bits of research to actually be quite helpful because it validates that person's experience. This is serious, so we are going to use serious language.
But I think that's also about when you ask that question, it's also be prepared to take a step back from it and don't jump to conclusions, because there's further on from there to expand on that. And I'm very conscious that when I have those sorts of conversations, and sometimes with people I've worked with for a long point, I can afford to be very direct and go, okay, where's your thinking at just now?
Yeah.
What's been happening for you today? And anytime I have that disclosure, the first thing I do is thank them for trusting me with that.
Yeah. Because that's it, you know. You think about it from that person's perspective, this is a massive thing that they probably haven't shared with anyone. And this does feel at this time like it is their only solution. So to share that with you, you might do something that might prevent them from being able to do that today. And that's quite scary. So yeah, you're right. You know, thank you for sharing that with me. That must have been really difficult for you to say. You're important. You know, I want to hear more. Tell me.
I appreciate the trust you've given me.
Yeah. It's a gift. I always think, it's not happened to me hundreds of times, probably, definitely more than 10, but less than 20 times where I've asked the question and people have said yes. I always just think I feel very privileged that they've chosen to trust me with that information. I'm not saying I'm not also a bit scared, because of course I'm human. It is a serious thing. And I think it's quite natural to feel like, okay, I need to do this right, if you like, isn't it? And even though there isn't a right or wrong way to do it, I think you put that pressure on yourself to want to help in the best possible way. But to just slow down, I think, is the most important, and the thing that we do want to rush to fix it. So thank them, let them get it out. Yeah, thanks for sharing that with me. Tell me about it. Definitely.
So I'm wondering, Holly, what's the difference between suicidal thoughts and suicidal ideation?
Well, so suicidal thoughts and suicidal ideation are quite similar. I kind of think that suicidal ideation is very much kind of medical, technical language, and suicide first aid is designed to be accessed by anybody. So we've tried our best to take away the jargon and the medical terminology to keep it in a way that people will understand, as in suicide thoughts and suicide behavior. Suicide thoughts being that, thinking of suicide in some way, and suicide behavior being that acting upon that. And within that, you could go a bit deeper and think about your planning and your preparing phase and all of that kind of side of things. But I kind of feel like we need to simplify and demystify the whole topic of suicide without it being, there's so much language that we can talk about, like a successful suicide and unsuccessful suicide, medically speaking, completed and incompleted. These are medical language. But when you think about it, for someone who has made an attempt on their life and survived, you would not want to be described as unsuccessful or incompleted. You want to me, the success is the person that's alive today.
It's a barrier, isn't it, to that person and people understanding what is going on with someone rather than all that medical, technical.
Definitely. And I kind of feel like definitely within people who work within mental health, there is so much jargon. You only have to have a little look at the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. It's like, absolutely, it's like 300 mental health conditions in there, I kind of for yours, see where it is, I went to buy the new one the other day and it was like £120. I thought, no, not getting it, not yet. When you think about it, I've been doing lots of kind of just research lately and just a bit of soul searching around what are the benefits of a diagnosis? How can we try so desperately hard to fit people in these minute little tiny boxes?
I would agree, because I think sometimes the diagnosis criteria becomes a barrier in itself.
Absolutely.
Because it becomes very, and I'm picking my words very carefully here, it becomes very structured. Yet we as a human individual are less so than that. We are far more variable and far more, we're all unique. Our experiences are unique. What is, or what feels like is unsustainable to one person will be nowhere near that for someone else. And that's also about recognizing that this isn't about our interpretation, it's about the individual's interpretation.
Yeah, And if you literally took away the labels from everybody and started to look at what that person's experience was and what that person's symptoms are, and started to treat the symptoms and the experience rather than the label of the diagnosis, which, being a bit controversial, very much fits with pharmaceutical companies' agendas, doesn't it? To have this drug that treats this particular thing and this drug that treats this particular thing. But actually, if you chucked all that in the bin and started to give people what they needed, whether that's therapy or medication or whatever combination of that it would be, based upon that person's experience, I think we probably have higher rates of recovery than what we do.
Well, I'm just also conscious that I'm going to cycle back to those conversations, because I think sometimes we underestimate the importance of that connection, of the power of community and the power of those around us to influence on that, to integrate us so that we're part of that.
Yeah.
And
if you guys have seen, there's been a study done by Harvard University that's like an 85-year-old study. And it's like the longest ever study about happiness and long life. And you've got your lifespan, you've got your health span, haven't you? And how kind of like happy people are in lives. And it started 85 years ago, and I can't work out what year that was, but it started then in Harvard. And you know, I think John F. Kennedy was one of the original participants of this. And all they did was they just kind of took a snapshot of these people and they looked at them going through their years, and they took into account their children's, and they looked at everything. And they looked at factors that increased people's like happiness, life, etc. And you will think things like money, healthy diet, exercise will be those things that are really kind of making people have long lives. And yeah, you know, there was people within this study that then did, you know, have lots of risk factors, and they did, you know, some of them die young, etc. But they looked, the biggest factor of everything was connection, social connection. And they found that people that did have, and it wasn't necessarily being married with children or anything like that, it was having that connection to community. Those people who had a sense of purpose and had connection within their groups and within their work and felt like they had that purpose and that sense of belonging, lived longer, happier, healthier lives. I just think that's
sorry, Ollie. Aren't they comparing now social isolation to cigarettes, or that equivalent of with the effects on health?
Yeah. I mean, yeah. Social isolation, the Age UK report that 40% of all deaths can be attributed to loneliness.
Well, you look at the long-term impact of COVID on society across the globe. And I'm not talking about the physical aspect in terms of people who have caught and contracted COVID and the outputs from that. I'm actually talking about the social impact that even now is rippling still through our communities.
Definitely.
And in a way, that was probably the single largest study possible in the power of community socialization and the impact when that is removed. And we're still monitoring and seeing the impact of that now.
Well, you just have to see on the news, isn't it? When Prince Philip died, and at the funeral, the Queen was just sat there isolated all by herself.
Yeah.
And that's a really sad, lonely place to be. And then people couldn't visit their grandparents or whomever in care homes. A whole host of other things he's saying, Ali, that went along with that.
Our social skills are practiced. Our community skills are practiced. These are things we learn. And then when we're taken out of that cycle for a prolonged period of time, our skill level in this drops.
Yeah.
And then it becomes more challenging for us to regain that. These settings that previously we never thought twice about suddenly become really anxiety-inducing. So it becomes something that feels quite alien because we haven't done it for such a long period of time. Yeah. And we've almost got to give ourselves that grace to relearn those skills.
Yeah.
To build those. Because they haven't been in play for such a long time.
Not like when we go back into it, it wasn't like all of a sudden COVID was over and we were all hugging in the streets. And I think that's what people were anticipating when the first lockdown was we'd have a vaccine, all of a sudden it'd be fine and we'd all be able to go and hug in the streets kind of thing. And the reality is it's been such a long drawn out, and there's been both sides, haven't there? There's still people walking around with masks on who are still living in that place of fear right now, who might be vulnerable, who I've seen friends and family members fall out because they're sitting on different sides of the fence of whether they, kind of the fear that they're living in with regards to COVID, whatever you might feel about that. People have had differences of opinion. It's still going on, isn't it? We're going to be feeling this for years to come, I feel. Definitely. Which is another risk factor. With regards to suicide during lockdown, it was really surprising to see that the rates did not rise in the immediate aftermath of COVID. And there's a brilliant professor, Professor Appleby. He's like the lead suicide prevention person across the UK. And he reported that and said that the rates did not rise. And at the time, I remember thinking, well, that just can't be true because loneliness is going to have such an impact. But actually, there was, so many risk factors that were increased by that loneliness. But actually, there was so many risk factors that were reduced, the furlough system, the fact that people were self-employed were getting some income. There was obviously those million people who were excluded from that. I'm sure probably, I know I was one in that million that was excluded, and I'm sure you guys probably were as well. But there was lots of support that was going on, and perhaps there was a bit more around things where I know I saw my girlfriends more during COVID we'd get together on a Friday night and we'd have a little quiz and we'd take it in turns. And there was some aspects, those people that had nobody felt it, I think, 100-fold. But for those people who, there were some things that the government had put in place and that society had put in place. So interestingly, suicide rates did not rise. But what we are seeing now with the financial cost of living crisis is we are seeing significant rises, both in access to call lines and helplines, and sadly in suicide rates as well, which is hugely concerning.
Do you think there's a layered impact because it's almost like the ripple from from the lifting of lockdown, and what you've now got is a shift in a lot of working practices and a lot of patterns that were largely voluntary or essential, but now are almost, it feels like there's a shift in like home working and flexible working. There's a most definite change in attitude towards that now. You layer that on top of that with the economic crisis, and you have people who are feeling very out of place with where they are at that point in time, who are seeing not just the economic issues, but are maybe struggling with the socialization, with demands in terms of changes to working practices, that are all rippling through and impacting and building the pressure.
And these are all new risk factors that I don't know what the stats are on how many people used to work from home, but it must be like 1% used to be, you know what I mean? I'm making that up, but now what do you reckon? Like maybe 30% of people are working from home, This is something that is such a new risk factor. And we don't know the
withdrawal of that though, because there's almost the change where, and I think a lot of people are struggling where, so it was okay to be this flexible while this was going on, but now you're withdrawing that privilege now, and I can't get a decent enough valid response in terms of why, apart from just because.
Yeah, because someone else has started doing it and all of a sudden we're all going to follow suit, isn't it really?
Well, all these companies are paying for renting out all these millions on properties they're not using. So there's justification there. But I believe something like 76% of people hate their jobs that they're doing.
That's a massive percentage.
Yeah. And I suppose really, seeing your colleagues, because I've, been in jobs that I've not enjoyed, you know what I mean? And I've had, bosses that I'd rather have not been working with, etc. I think most people have in their lifetimes. But actually, you have that friend or that colleague and that person that you say that is the person that kind of gets you through it, isn't it? You have a laugh with them no matter what. And I know what you're saying, Ali, because like we went down that way where everyone was working from home, and now all of a sudden it's saying, almost like saying, you were too busy putting your washing on or sorting out your dishwasher midway through the day, so now we're going to drag you back into the office. now I've got used to this flexible working. There's more change to come. And I think, everybody, change is difficult for everybody. It's very rare to find someone that relishes huge amounts of change. But yet, the last kind of 5 years, it's been constant changes in policies, even like Brexit. Is it happening? Is it not happening? Then COVID, then this and that. There's like so many things, isn't there, that are going on, which does make us vulnerable.
Talking about vulnerable, is there, not having to go into the whole of it, but is there certain demographics or people who are more vulnerable than others?
I think it largely comes down to risk factors. So, as we know, when you look at the rates of suicide over the last 10 years, what's gone up the most is young girls. That has been a rate that's risen quite rapidly, which I feel like when it comes to suicide, it's always very much male dominated. And it's because we know that, it used to be 3/4 of suicides were male. Now it's 70%.
Men are more successful, aren't they? Because the means tend to be, if the right word is, more violent.
Yes.
Women.
Yeah. Women might use more means, of which there is a period of time afterwards where they can seek help and reverse whatever it is that they might have done. Absolutely. And for men, that's not. So that's methodology might be shifting slightly. But women, I think, have been always underrepresented with regards to suicide research and suicide prevention strategies, because 75% of suicides are male. So you can understand why most of it.
There's also that disclosure piece, isn't there? So if you look at the trends in terms of means and method, actually, how many of those are undisclosed in terms of the female population, purely and simply because of the means chosen?
Yeah.
And therefore, there may be a point where nobody found out.
Absolutely. How many people just woke up the next morning and put it down to something that happens? Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So gender is obviously something to consider. But then, with regards to our LGBTQIA plus population, we know that there are increased risks there. The latest statistic through Stonewall is saying that 1 in 10 people within the LGBT plus community have experienced hate crime in the last 12 months. And that's gone up quite significantly. So when we think about in this day and age, you would, I used to stand there quite confidently and say, I've been a secondary school teacher for, since 2008 and, don't do it anymore, but, have worked with lots of children. And I would say that going back to just 2008 and maybe to a few years ago, what a child might have to go through to come out, with regards to being, with their sexuality, I would say that the children seem to be slightly more accepting now than maybe just back in 2008. But when it comes to society as a whole, I'm not so sure anymore, because how can there be an increase in hate crime when we are more aware of what is going on and we have more access to being exposed to different things through social media? You would expect that to be going down, but sadly it's not. Our transgender population, 46% have attempted suicide. 46%. That is just absolutely ginormous. But then you look at that, you have really decisive political decisions being made around, transgender laws, rights issues. Politicians are always making it acceptable to have really extreme views around trans rights. And so you've got to consider what the impact of that is going to be. So there is definitely a lot of support and work that needs to go in to supporting our LGBTQIA plus, community population there. So that's kind of, your identity, if you like. That's another sort of risk factor there. And then, there's you could go really, really deep with this, certain professions, more male-dominated professions, construction, military, ex-military, there are higher rates of mental health. It lends itself to perhaps, some of what you might have experienced when you were there. When I first got involved with you two amazing people, it was very much around a conversation that we'd had online about how certain aspects of mental health training are not welcomed with open arms into, the army in particular. And why is that? And it's very much around mental strength and mental resilience, as opposed to supporting mental illness. Tricky balance to strike there, isn't it? So it's about trying to kind of tap into these, I suppose, hard to reach like professions maybe. It's quite hard, I think, quite a lot of the construction and that kind of aspect. It's very much gig culture, isn't it? Where you're on a job for you might be a 1 or a 2 or a 3-man band, and there isn't the, logistics to be able to put on a course for 16 people if there's only one of you, and kind of get to understand what's going on there. Plus,
so that comes back to that whole concept in terms of the idea of the power of the community, doesn't it? About what you're a part of and who you belong to, because that's where your conversations happen.
Definitely.
And overwhelmingly, we lose people when those conversations don't happen.
Yeah.
I think there's an organisation called BEN for the construction industry.
Yeah, there's Mates in Mind as well, who are another fantastic one. And they are, and I think all of them, are doing a marvellous job of trying to promote that message. But you're right, it's that lack of community. All of my family on the male side are all builders, ceilings and stuff like that, And they were, on one job, that they'd be there all the time for like 3 weeks and then that's it, gone. They'd never see the people that were on the site again. So who is there to notice that person is declining,
But they are different from what they were 3 weeks ago, because 3 weeks after that, they're within a different group of people.
Yeah, that's it. And I think that's why it's so important that it becomes okay to have those conversations, that having a conversation about your mental health becomes as normal as having a conversation about the headache or the amount of sleep you had last night. Or we've got to make it that we can get to asking the difficult questions quicker by normalizing all conversations around mental health so that we are able to spot it a bit quicker.
As we started off at the beginning, is removing all that stigma and removing the barriers of that communication to enable the people to be able to talk about these things.
Definitely. And it's not an easy one to solve, is it?
No.
Stigma has been around for generations and it will be around for generations. But I think you've just got to keep tapping away at it, haven't you? Education, schools, there's a role that needs to happen. I have worked in a number of secondary schools, and the amount of learning that the children do about mental health is minute. It really is minute.
Well, you look at even, for instance, things like our medical professions, and for most of the medical professions, unless mental health is your specialism, it's an optional extra.
And
that means that our medical professionals themselves are under-resourced in terms of their knowledge and understanding and their capacity to respond. But I'm going to pick up again on community and conversations, because there's almost like a cultural issue in there, isn't there, in terms of us as a culture, as a community, making choices over how much we engage with each other.
Definitely.
Over how much care we share and interest we share in each other, and how separate we choose to keep ourselves. And actually, the more we create those bonds and create the opportunity for those bonds, the safer everyone becomes. The more we care, the safer everyone becomes.
Yeah. And it is, isn't it? It's everybody's responsibility to keep an eye on everybody.
Mm-hmm.
I was watching, I told you about this, Ali, a little while ago, was a video on clean language. I can't remember the name of who the instructor was, but she had this nurse in with her. And this nurse had gone through her course and was chatting about what she, how she normally converses with people. And it's normally the case of it with everybody. It's, how are you doing today? Yeah, I'm fine. Or I think it was over asking about, how are you busy today? She goes, yeah, I'm always busy, sort of thing. So most people just go leave it at that. She then started asking this lady or her colleague 6 questions. And she got really quite deep into how she really was.
Mm.
She goes, oh, actually, I felt heard now. I felt listened to, and I've managed to relieve a lot of her stress and tension just with those 6 questions.
I like that. Yeah, because we only scratch the surface, don't we?
We do, yeah.
And we often say, you're right, and carry on walking sometimes, don't we? Don't even wait for the response,
Yeah.
Or we say it like it's an apostrophe or a full stop in a sentence without actually intending to genuinely find out, are you okay?
Yeah. And if someone says, no, I'm not actually, it's like, oh, goodness me, why are they telling me that, isn't it? And I think it's right, isn't it? We all need to, I always call it helpful nosiness, have that element of being interested in people. Compassionate curiosity is probably a better phrase. Are we, be genuinely interested?
Yeah, because people go, oh, yeah, I'm just off I need to go off to see my mate over there or whatever it is. I don't have that conversation.
Yeah,
it's too difficult.
Yeah, it's okay to not, be the one that gets involved every single time. I think that's a really important thing, actually, to kind of like make a point of, really, is that sometimes you're not in a good place. There are certain times of the year, anniversaries, perhaps, my brother's birthday, perhaps, that actually if someone was going to tell me that they were thinking about suicide, I'd find that quite triggering and quite difficult. And there's other times of the year where I'm the best person to support people because I have got a level of empathy of how difficult that must be. And it's okay to have those days where you're not the right person. It's not like you say, I'm not helping you and you move away, but you might direct them to somebody else, or you might say, if that person's in crisis, you might have to just put your own self to the side for a moment. But actually, most of the time, you might be able to give someone else a heads up that that person needs a conversation, or just link them in with another helpline or someone else that can offer that support, because you're your own best resource. And there's 1,000 cheesy phrases for that, isn't there? You can't pour from an empty cup.
But I think that's also about knowing your own limitations and keeping yourself safe too.
Yeah.
And that's also about recognizing that if this is help that is needed, support that is needed, and you're unable to provide that because of where you are, then that's also about saying, I recognize where you're at and I want to help you find what you need. And unfortunately, no, it's not where I can provide that right now for you, but I'll help you find it.
Absolutely. Yeah, it is, isn't it? How often do people kind of say after the event, I did recognize that something wasn't right. I should have. I wish I'd, what if, isn't it? And it is about kind of just taking the gift, really, that someone's giving you when they let you know that they're not right. And they're giving you the opportunity to help, and it is a gift.
There's also something in there, Holly, about recognizing that sometimes when we do lose somebody to suicide, through suicide, that it's the what ifs that stay with you. It's the what ifs that have you in a tailspin thinking if onlys. And what ifs and if onlys are incredibly difficult to deal with, the unknowns.
Definitely. And I think, one thing that has always been a comfort to me is to know that there's never one reason for a suicide. It's this kind of perfect storm of different life events that might be battering that person, and combined with risk factors and things that might be going on for them that might have made their levels of resilience, smaller at that particular point in their life. It is like this kind of, this point of overwhelm, isn't there? That there may be a straw that broke the camel's back, but if there wasn't that one, there's very likely that person would have been another one. It's not that one thing that happened that was the life or death thing that happens in most cases. So I think that was a comfort to me, to know that it wasn't perhaps the phone call that I didn't pick up, or the fact that I wasn't there at that time, or the fact that I didn't check in and all the rest of it. In actual fact, this was something that happened. But you're right, those what ifs and those maybes, that's just part of it. That's the kind of like, and I think that happens, not just suicide loss, isn't it? There's so many different types of loss where people wish that they could change those final interactions, I suppose, isn't it? And I suppose with that, is time a great healer? I'm not sure. Sometimes you feel like you're back on that cycle and then you go back to the beginning sometimes, don't you? But it brings us back to the beginning, doesn't it? Of calming that place in our lives to be able to, I think that's one thing, isn't it? Being able to say, yeah, I do wish I'd done things differently. And I do have all these what ifs, and that's hard. But that is part of grief. And everybody going through grief is experiencing these kind of thoughts as well.
I think it's also about recognizing that while there's an invitation to pay attention, to notice, and to be brave enough to ask, there's also an invitation to somebody in crisis to be brave enough to share. Yeah. And if they choose not to, then it limits the support that can be given and available. And that sometimes those what ifs aren't your choice, aren't your actions.
Yeah.
Someone else.
You know, suicide is a preventable death in most cases, but not every death can be prevented, because you're right. I always think if you get to the stage where you've asked someone if they're thinking about suicide and they tell you yes, that is a sure sign that you can help that person that day, because if they were convinced or sure, they'd say nothing. Mm-hmm. You'd say, okay, they're not thinking about suicide today, and you'd go, and then they might do whatever they were going to do, you know. And I think it's right, you know, have I lost someone to suicide where I've asked the question? Yeah, a very good friend of mine, I knew he was living with suicide thoughts. I asked him all the time. Sometimes he'd say yes, and we'd work through it. This time he said no, and he was, and he did it, you know. And for a long time I thought, goodness me, you know, the role that I do and the fact that I'm teaching people, how did I not recognize that he wasn't telling the truth? And actually, yeah, you know, you do a bit of soul searching after that. But the reality is we meet people where they are, isn't it? We read the situation as best we can, and we believe what that person tells us and deal with what we can deal with it on a moment by moment basis, isn't it? But hindsight and guilt are incredibly hard sometimes, aren't they?
Yeah, so
well, it's not your burden to carry, though, is it, Holly?
Yeah, absolutely not.
As you were talking about grief, there's all sorts of grief, bereavement. So not just a physical death.
Yeah.
It could be a friend or a family member who's had a serious illness, a loss of a long-term job, a whole host of other things that are grief, but are not really recognised as maybe as such.
A living loss.
Mm.
Absolutely. Yeah. Health conditions, isn't there? You know, you could just list them. Anything where I always feel like all of this, it's kind of control, isn't it? It's when something has happened outside of your control. And I know that links. I was listening to your ACEs podcast, and I just thought it was just incredibly fascinating, and about that kind of aspects of, you know, what is abuse. And in actual fact, anything that is a negative impact on us, I feel you can always take it back to that lack of control. Mm-hmm. You know, so much of all of our negative experiences is when something happens that is outside of our control, isn't it? Yeah.
Your choice is removed.
Definitely.
What are your takeaways, please, Holly?
So takeaways is, first of all, you know, you can only do what you can do. Get educated, find out more. You know, you don't have to attend a course. You know, you can absolutely just find stuff out on the internet, listening to things like this. You know, you might choose to do some training. It's totally, you know, wherever you are with regards to your place, but find out how to have that conversation and practice it. Talk to yourself in the mirror. Talk about asking that question. You know, saying the word suicide out loud, if you've not done it before, feels uncomfortable. It makes you squirm a little bit inside. So practicing in that makes it sound like you're confident when you're asking. And find out where your local support services that you can signpost people to. There's a brilliant service called the Hub of Hope, which is a free app that anyone within the UK can just download on their phone. And you type in the postcode of where you are, and it'll bring up loads of support services that are nearby you. So you can kind of use that. That's a brilliant tool to kind of have in your toolkit. And really, just know that just by having the conversation about suicide, you are making it better. You are part of the solution, because by having that conversation, you are shining a light, reducing the stigma, and making it so that people know that this is something that could happen to them or someone that they know. And that's okay, in the sense that it is common and lots of people do recover. So it's not something to be so terrified about.
What strikes me, Holly, is sometimes we don't actually get the grace of recognising how important something that we have taken for granted may be to somebody else, and something as simple as saying, "Are you okay today?" Even if there's nothing significant that's maybe thinking they're different, but just the fact that maybe we regularly check in with people, actually stops that point of crisis getting to that point of crisis.
Definitely.
Because somewhere along the line, enough people had that conversation to say, are you okay?
Yeah.
And that's something that maybe we need to practice a bit more with everyone in our lives, regardless of whether we think there is a risk there or not, because that maybe slows down and stops some of those journeys.
Yeah.
And changes the direction.
Definitely. I love that. Yeah.
And with your excellent training provision, how can people get hold of you, Holly?
Oh, yes. Well, they can have a look at my website, which is bloomingmind.co.uk. And I'm on all social media, so please just connect with me as you want to.
And I would thoroughly recommend training with you, Holly, because I know that certainly both Rich and I thoroughly enjoyed both courses we did with you, the mental health first aid and the suicide intervention.
Oh, thank you so much. And I'm just really glad I got to meet you both through it. I feel that's an absolute gift to me too. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Indeed. And a massive well done on everything you're doing, because the value that you're giving people through your podcasts is just incredible. So thank you very much for having me.
And as usual, all the links and all the support we've talked about will be available in the show notes, and we'll make sure that they're available on our other networks as well. Thank you.
And please do like, share and follow our podcast.
Yes, please do. Thank you.
Thank you.